Welcome to Left, East to West with me, Tom Parkin.
And me, Nikki Hill. Tom, did you know that as of this episode, we have been doing the podcast for 26 weeks, so exactly half a
Yep.
year. So we feel like it was a good time to take a look at what's happened over all those weeks and months, because it has been a flurry in Canadian politics and provincial politics, global
Mhm.
politics, and take a look at where we're going next. So we've had a chance to talk with really interesting guests about Canada's international relationships, developing the economy, separatists in Alberta and Quebec, battling high food and fuel prices and affordability, housing, pipelines. We've talked about it all, really. We've interviewed leaders from national and provincial politics, labor movement leaders, some really bright policy research, and advocates and economists. And we've watched a lot of events unfold, like a very turbulent BC Conservative leadership race, which is still having some fallout we're seeing in national politics this
Yep.
week. We covered the Ontario Liberal Party travails in its leadership race, and we've focused on something within almost every provincial legislature. I think we just missed PEI and New Brunswick so far, but we'll catch up with those folks, getting up to date on all the regional shifts and changes that are coming across the country. So it's been quite a
Yep.
packed 6 months.
Yeah, it's been fun. We've probed regionalism as a theme of Canada, and both the challenge and opportunity for social democrats. In a way, that's kind of a theme of the show, to profile the whole country and dig into different tendencies and ideas. Guests come onto the show, and they really talk about different situations and problems in different parts of the country, and I find this so interesting, Nikki. And so, taking it all together, let's reflect on the themes that we're seeing in the conversations we've had, and maybe explore it in three buckets. First, uh, federal politics, themes in federal politics. Then let's take a look at federal-provincial relations, which has been pretty intense in the last few months and changed. And then maybe a little cross-country tour and take a look at some of the provinces and what's going on in each one of those places. So, Nikki, federally, I would say that the overarching federal story is the continued high support for the Carney Liberals.
Yeah.
But certainly some of the Prime Minister's actions and comments have raised some doubts, some eyebrows, some doubts. So let's talk about that. But also, if doubts are rising, and polls from Liaison and Abacus do show some rising job disapproval score, although,
Mhm.
listen,
Early. Yeah.
Carney's still pretty popular. Um,
Yeah.
if that is, though, a trend, how come we're not seeing an opposition leader benefit from it? What do you think, Nikki?
Yeah, I actually think this recent period in time is why we're not seeing Poilievre as an opposition leader benefiter. Sort of alluded to it in talking about the ramifications of the BC Conservative leadership race too. I think, there doesn't appear to be a strategy here for Pierre Poilievre. We've seen him coming into BC trying to push on some wedge issues lately, but really, like, his leadership style has kind of
Yeah.
always been a head scratcher for me. He doesn't seem to have been able to pivot out of that really high point of popularity in before the previous election, when it looked like, the assumption was for a good couple years probably that the Conservatives with his leadership were going to form the next government federally. And so when that didn't happen, how he
Mhm.
shows up as opposition leader in this current context, like, it really hasn't changed. And I think one of
Yeah.
the things I've just been watching is and speaking back to why Poilievre and the BC Conservative leadership race are tied together is this real infighting he seems to keep
Yeah.
driving in the national conservative movement. So you're like, we're over a month. We're heading in, 6 weeks after the BC Conservative leadership race, which we've talked about a lot. But what's in the news this week about Pierre Poilievre isn't, what his response is on things like the BC federal government agreement on major projects or on,
Yeah.
affordability issues. It's him going after one of those BC Conservative leadership candidates and campaigns in his Stampede
Yeah.
speech, which is now, spilling over into what they have to be responsive on. So
Called her
I
called
think,
her a
like,
liberal. Called her
yeah,
a
it's
liberal
fascinating.
being run by
Someone who
liberal
voted for
lobbyists.
him, right? Like, you
Yeah, and
pushed in someone who actually voted for you
right.
as leader out to have to speak against comments you're making. So, like, fascinating to see in a leadership style at a point where you should be really trying to work to unite your party to
Yeah.
back to where you were, that causing this huge now frenzy of fighting, which, for those of us that are sitting out here watching, eating our popcorn, watching the public conservative infighting that continues, like, bring it on. But
Yeah.
I would argue like these tactics are why he's just not
No,
seeing that
it's
traction.
yeah. You probably saw the tweets between um, Nick Kuvalis and I think Corey
Yeah.
Tanaik and just back and forth, different within the conservative movement. It's like
Yeah.
the implication and really absolutely 100%. Polyev kicked it off and by calling Christian Elliott, by implication, a liberal who was being run by
Clearly.
liberal
Yeah.
lobbyists. And those
Yeah.
liberal lobbyists that he was referring to were people like Nick
His
Kuvalis
people.
and Tony and Kaneki. So that's pretty insulting.
Yeah.
It doesn't get more insulting than that.
Yeah.
So yeah, not a great way to run a party. So yeah, I have to agree with you. That's one reason why we're not seeing Mr. Polyev pick up anything because
Yeah.
he's just screwing himself day after day, it seems, putting himself in more difficulty. And I
Yeah.
wonder, also, he's kind of, what is he left with after Carney's right turn? Let's just,
Yeah.
call it what it is. Climate policy, where's Carney on climate policy? Right? I
Yeah.
don't think he has one, right? Tax policy, got rid of carbon tax, got rid of the capital inclusion rate increase, got rid of the luxury boat tax and the private airplane luxury tax.
Yeah.
Anything else? What else did he take? Um,
Well,
Obviously
there's a
reduce the
lot pending too. Yeah.
yeah. So that whole tax agenda is really a conservative tax agenda. Um, Obviously the pipelines and all that. We'll get into that a little bit more, but
Hmm.
the industrial carbon rate being reduced. Just it's like, where is there for Mr. Polyev to go, even if Carney is less appreciated?
Yeah, I do think it's one of those things where, I mean, certainly they've got smart people around them who could, and maybe some of the folks that they've been fighting against could help out with some polling
Yeah,
numbers and seeing where the public is sitting, right? Because we know when
but
looking at polling, the public is still really focused on those cost of living, affordability, and then it ties
right.
into, do I have a job? Can I feed my family? Right now, language. And then, the other thing that really jumped out to me with Polyev is him going after the tanker ban and sort of trying to frame that people who support the continuation of the tanker ban are these, left-wing radicals. It's like the majority of British Columbians support the
I-
tanker ban. Like if you want to
But also,
win in BC,
geez,
which is
yeah,
fertile ground for him, right? So I think it is like those issues because Carney's, and maybe this also falls into the NDP space. Like Carney's obviously leaving a lot of questions. I think it's been I spent a lot of time in the environmental and climate world. A lot of those folks not only loaned their votes to Carney, but they also joined the Liberals to support that leadership race process. So there's a lot of questions going on. I think
hmm
they're, had looked at Carney's background around climate and finance and policy as a hopeful continuation of the Trudeau path, but really having their doubts now. Certainly that's been solidified with folks like Guilbeault leaving, but it doesn't leave a lot of space. It almost feels like Carney's like taking that space where Poilievre could be in the policy debate more, right? On those major projects, on
yeah,
that deregulation, on the rolling back of things like pesticides and, things that seem like pretty motherhood. I think the public, so it's not, I think, really crowding out Poilievre as well in the direction that Carney's going.
and I don't like for Polyev, like on the tanker ban and like Alberta got
Yeah.
its pipeline. It's got an approval for a pipeline. We're going to spend a lot of money on another pipeline. It wasn't the Northern Gateway idea that was going to go to
Yeah.
Kitimat. Um, but kind of like, so what?
Yeah.
Like, count the win. But this guy seems to be intent on counting the lose and just wants to always find the negative in everything. And that just
Yeah.
becomes so irritating to me.
Yeah.
Like, this ship has sailed. You're whipping a dead horse. I mean, I don't know how you want to put it, but like that's not the conversation anymore. So I don't understand why he would want to.
Yeah.
Kelly, I'm sorry, not Kelly. Carrie Lynn Finley also seems to be in that track of complaining about things that are like,
Hmm.
do you guys have a problem with yes, like winning something? You
Yeah.
got what you wanted.
Yeah, it's interesting that the BC Conservatives have been talking about the tanker ban as an economic blockade this week that's brought
It's
in by the NDP. The tanker
oh,
ban's been in place for decades. Like, we're not talking about a new
yeah, I know.
policy here, right? So,
No, I know.
but no, I think this is where it's why we see Poilievre coming into BC, trying to push on things like private property rights and reconciliation. Like, they're kind of throwing that policy jello at the wall. But I think, like we've talked a lot in the
Mm,
show, maybe in terms of the things that aren't shifting, people's concern about their gas prices and their food prices is not shifting, it's growing.
no.
I would think that the, working middle class space that someone like Polyev could be at it, instead of trying to find these wedge issues, you could
Yeah,
really be digging into building. So then, that does leave space for the Democrats that's not being occupied by either Carney or the opposition at this
yeah.
stage, right?
Now, I did see there was an interesting poll the other day. I can't remember which couple it was, but the question was, how urgent do you see climate change?
Hmm.
And it was about 50% of people rated it as a 7 to 10.
Yeah. That was
So I
StatsCan
looked
data,
at,
I think, Tom.
was it? Okay.
Yeah, I think it's yeah,
Yeah.
it's yeah.
And I thought, it's interesting because I don't think the climate denial or the fact that climate change is being created by humans and created by emissions, I don't think that that has changed. It's just that it's being disregarded
Mhm.
in the current environment.
Yeah,
So there's a latent concern there, and that kind of brings me back to Avi Lewis
yeah.
because he's obviously very strong on that point that he wants to see climate change and economic change work together. But I would say, the NDP is up in the polls, but not to the level you want to see.
No, not
And
yet.
then I think a difficult poll for Avi came out last week where it showed that his awareness awareness of him
Mhm.
was very low.
Yeah,
So he's got a lot of work to do.
yeah,
That's for sure. And does he have the work plan to do it? Does he have the strategy to get himself well known and to focus in on the issues that you were talking about jobs and paychecks,
yeah.
affordability? Sometimes I see him drift off to the side, and on issues that he likes,
Mhm.
which is great, but you got to connect with the voters. So
Yeah. Yeah,
I have
I think
concern
it's
with that.
well, and if we think about the issues in the past, and the climate piece, the reason I think that you're talking about the StatsCan data, Tom, is that on climate being so high, it was like 50% of Canadians still have this overarching fear of climate change. We're going into wildfire season
Yep.
already, drought. So it's logical, but it doesn't, I don't think decision makers, they're seeing it so far down other polling data. So I actually was, happy to see that StatsCan put out something as that credible source
Mm,
on data here. So I do think it is how to but I think that's, weighs into how the public thinks about climate and the way that it can impact their lives directly, right?
well,
And that is going to be those wildfires. But I
that's right.
think it is on finding the issues for Lewis, how they bring together that public concern about where things are. And again, I think it kind of goes back to what about climate impacts me and my family and my daily life here
Right.
when we're seeing some
I
of
agree.
those sorts of
I
stats.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I think there's a couple of things that they haven't tried that, might be worth trying that along this vein, which is, insurance costs, the costs
Yeah.
of like, just if you wanna just monetize or, imagine this in dollar terms and put it in affordability terms in that prism, there's lots of stuff to go at and say
Totally.
that climate change is costing us already. Now,
Mhm.
who's paying that? We are. Who's
Yeah.
causing it? These oil companies that are making billions and billions of profiting from war, blah, 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 blah. There's a lane there he could go down.
Yeah.
Might be
Yeah.
interesting.
It is, and I think I was looking at some polling this week, or had some shared with me, which shows it's really fascinating to see how high it was a Western Canada poll, how high the public's distrust of corporations is right now. And probably not
Uh,
a huge shift, but still remains very high,
right.
right? So when you add in some of the things you talked about, I think there is that ability to sort of, not that I'm saying go after every corporation, but I think there is an increasing awareness here for the public about where some of these hardships are laying. And it's not government action
Hmm.
in many ways. It's how, government could be stepping in different ways. But I think there is a growing concern in the public from looking at some of this data about the actions of corporations that are impacting lives. So that
Sure.
does go back into that food. But I think,
Yeah.
for Lewis, he's gonna it is, I think it takes a little bit. I think if the issues where he got some of the most traction though in the past few months, it probably is that predatory grocery pricing, right? And
Definitely.
I think that all feeds into where the
Yes.
public's at and why
And
people perked up and paid attention to that issue.
and his food and his, grocery store idea. I mean, people are like, well,
Yeah.
let's try it. Can't be
Yeah.
worse.
Yeah.
Right? And then you got the right wing think tanks just dismissing it out of hand. It's like, well, why you guys don't even want to try this? Obviously, what
Yeah.
your guys are suggesting is not working. Um, so yeah, I think he's got a couple of eh, I don't know, arrows in his quiver
Yeah.
that he could be focusing in on. And then it's just, I think it's obviously tough for being a leader of a small third party at this
It
point to
is.
get the media coverage, but that also
It is.
argues for why, when you do get it, you got to be really focused on what you want to say.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
so,
and you really have
so
to
I,
drive it. I mean, I've probably talked
yeah.
before about, staffing Jack Layton when he first became leader and had no staff. And,
Oh,
we literally drove to
oh,
newspapers and tried to get in with the editorial team when he'd be in BC because you're not getting that traction. So,
yeah.
and I think the other thing for Lewis too is, he's made the decision, and I actually am, people have big feelings on this. He's made the decision not to run in one of the 7
Mhm.
by-elections that are coming up. I don't have a lot of big feelings on this. I'm probably somewhere in the middle about whether it's
Yeah.
a good idea, having worked with, Layton when he didn't have a seat, with Carol James here in BC when she didn't have one. Like, I think when there's, advantages and disadvantages to getting the seat this early and then being in the House when it's back for such a long period. So, and getting the right seat, I think, is important. But that's going to be, I think, how he then strategically, while there are 7 by-elections, inserts himself into the debate as well, will be,
Hmm.
a big,
Hmm.
has to be a very well thought out strategy to not step in on those candidates, but to still show up as a national
Hmm.
leader when we've got this high number going on.
Yeah. I mean, I remember this from Jagmeet Singh when he won. He didn't have a seat.
Yeah.
Um, and I think there's a significant difference between the two of them that's not being taken into account on the calculation. For Jagmeet Singh, he won as a leader who could win anywhere, right? Because he won in
Mm,
Brampton, and the NDP had
yeah.
never won a seat in Brampton, and he was going to save
Yeah.
the party. He was going to win in the suburbs. He was going to connect with different communities, and
Yeah.
that was kind of, he was hired on that basis, if you can say it that
Yeah.
way. Avi was like, your party's had the crap kicked out of it, and you're really taking it over at a low point, and there's no
Yeah.
expectation. So if he
Yeah.
was to run in a seat and lose, I just don't think it has the same as if Jagmeet had won and lost. Um,
Yeah.
so but on the other hand, if Avi did run and won, that might also it really is one of those things. It's really, is it possible to know, because there's downsides on
Yeah.
every outcome, and you can't predict the outcome. So
No.
I don't know whether it's the right decision or the wrong decision, but I think, just thinking, it's not the same as it was with Jack. It's not the same as it was
No.
with Jagmeet. It's a different
No.
kind of, just because the expectations of the NDP are very different and very low electorally right now.
Yeah,
So
and I think, like, if we draw into the Jack and or Carol James example, they both waited for the right seats in general
yeah.
elections in their homes, right? They
Mhm.
weren't. It wasn't a long time. I think Carol was only didn't have a seat for like 16 months. It wasn't long. We only had one by-election in that period she could have won in, which would have made zero sense. And the person
Mhm.
who is elected, got elected there in 2004, is still elected and is part of that community, right? Like, it's not. I actually argued at the time, and I think I still believe this, that Jagmeet, that Burnaby seat that he did win, was the wrong seat for him, right? It was in sort of the
Yeah.
wrong
He
province.
he got shotgunned into that thing. The
Yeah,
Liberals
so
played games
I
on
get
him.
it. You
Remember, if
wait.
there was a whole thing about, oh, we're going to open a seat in Brampton, and we're not,
Yeah.
and so he was like, but Liberals are great at that. They really are. So
Yeah,
anyway,
then we had he
um,
ends up in a Burnaby seat far from home, and there's a pandemic, right? Like,
yeah,
all of
yeah,
the
yeah.
all
Anyway,
of the things.
I don't think there's you can know that there's a right decision on this, because
Nah.
It's a tough one, very tough.
Yeah, but
So
a
I'm not
lot of people
I'm not
seem
gonna
to have opinions right now, so we're gonna go
really
with the
like strong
middle of the
opinions. You
road.
think?
Yeah, yeah, it's getting a
I
fair bit of
I
commentary
guess
and
I see
yeah,
it in the
on
news,
yeah,
but
yeah.
I don't see a lot of New Democrats having strong feelings other than
I'm seeing
on
some
this
strong
hand, on
feeling New
that hand.
Democrats. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, there you go. All right. All right.
Okay, well, that's our
Let's
federal.
yeah. Let's dig into the federal provincial stuff a little bit.
Yeah. So
Do you want
obviously,
to key on that
Fed
one? Yeah.
provincial relationships, these alliances are always going to be key in Canadian politics, particularly I think right now where we've got this bubbling separatist movement. We've got Alberta and Quebec both. A lot of shifts here going on potentially and how the public's thinking about those provinces. And it's not new that premiers need federal support, whether it's policy or funding, to
No.
move their provincial goals ahead. And obviously, prime ministers need to be attuned into those goals. They're share voters, they share goals as well within each of those provinces. But our question after these last 6 months of doing the podcast is: are the provinces currently in better alignment with the federal government under Carney and with each other than under Trudeau? But is something also being lost there right now? What do you think,
Mm.
Tom?
I would say probably the answer to the first question is yes, there is better alignment. We see less tension between Alberta and Ottawa. We see less tension between Alberta and BC. They've
Hmm.
kind of squared the deal. Um,
Which is
Carney
shocking with
seems
everything going on, right?
well, I think that's worth digging into a little bit about how
Yeah,
that came about. There's also the
yeah.
Quebec angle of Frechette coming back really with Carney's help. The PQ not doing as like coming down in the polls a bit.
Mhm.
So I would say on that score as well, better alignment between the provinces, between the governments and the feds. But is something being lost? I think so. Like we lost
Yeah.
any any vague idea that we have a climate plan in this country.
Yeah.
That just got sacrificed right off the bat. So
Yeah.
that's gone. Um, we've got we've got Alberta doing some so-called experimenting with healthcare delivery, but
Mhm.
it's credit card payment time. It's like put your
Mhm.
you want fast treatment, get your credit card out for things that are covered by the Alberta plan. So that's
Mhm.
contrary to Canada Health Act. Like I just don't see how it's not, but it's not being enforced because
Yeah.
because we want to just kind of get along.
Yeah. One thing I was thinking about though is something that Premier Eby says, and I think we probably heard Premier Can you say it as well, is how lonely it is for them as progressive premiers at that first minister's table, right? So I
Mm,
think, as we think about some of the relationships and dynamic with Carney, he's also dealing largely with, more conservative
yeah.
governments besides BC and Manitoba. So I think there could be a factor there as well in what the Fed provincial dynamic is just based on where that value set and priorities are
Mhm.
right now. But I mean, I think the biggest thing that we're seeing as a shift, and it's certainly, again, not new, but it's the big shift is where the majority of the provinces have these big deficits now. So,
Mm,
it really is, I think, only Manitoba that doesn't. And so, if they're dealing with massive deficits, they are so much more reliant on the federal
yeah.
government
Federal
to be
cash.
bringing the funding in. So they're going to play differently with the feds, try to access
Yeah.
some of that defense funds, try to access into some of the new infrastructure and housing and all of the things of the major
Hmm.
projects, right? And that they're much more dependent, I would argue, right now.
That's probably true. Yeah, and just to get back in your province, well, here in Ontario, we had a large deal with the feds about infrastructure. The usual
Yeah.
stuff, kind of infrastructure, but also housing. You guys had a housing. NBC had a housing arrangement with the feds that drew a fair bit of
Yeah.
controversone. The one in
Yeah.
Ontario did
Still.
not, although I would say that is actually the one that is under like clearly a bailout for condo owners.
Yeah.
The one I got actually a call from one of the folks in your premier's communications branch, right? Who was like, "No, Tom, this is you're not seeing this right." And he was really pushing this idea like these are depressed sales units, and we're going to scoop them.
Yeah.
And at the end of the conversation, I was like, okay, maybe, right? Because I was
Yeah.
initially quite critical of the idea, thinking, okay, this is
Mhm.
Carney.
Oh, they're reading your
Um,
Twitter. Is that what's happening, Tom?
I guess maybe I thought, but they were very insistent and kind of pushed the argument like, no, we're going to move in, we're going to take
Mhm.
liquidation prices below construction cost prices, and we're gonna push that into the rental stream, and that's going to
Yeah.
depress rent costs as well. So interesting. So what I thought was interesting, but if that's true,
Yeah.
what it suggests is that there were a very different approach in BC than in Ontario,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
kind of goes again to the flexibility of Mr. Carney ideologically.
Exactly. Cutting edge.
And I
Yeah.
think that's maybe that's kind of interesting, because I
Yeah.
see that he has a specific take on the world, very neoliberal in his ideas, but also, if your premier's position is correct, they're doing something quite different than.
Mhm.
So that's not a bad thing, but that's an interesting
Yeah.
um, that's an interesting idea about what federalism is,
Yeah, it is. And if you watch,
where the federal government doesn't really drive things; it kind of responds to regional
yeah.
requests.
And I mean, if you look at how both the Prime Minister and then and Minister Gregor Robertson
Uh-huh.
have been responding and talking about it, they are making it really clear, even in the last few days, that this is a BC project, or even in the
Mm.
push from the Conservatives nationally on this as well, as is a BC idea. So I think I think, and everyone agrees, and I probably won't get a call from the Premier's office for saying this, but I think I think partly the problem here was more the rollout on the comms side, right? So,
Oh,
you're negotiating
yeah.
these deals, step up, have the announcement, it's not quite ready for prime time, and that was visible.
No.
Now, what I would say, which isn't always visible, is, Premier Eby he's a housing policy guy. The only policy
Yeah.
plank he got out in the leadership race before it was truncated in BC in 2024 was his housing policy. He's, has a high interest in housing. He is been really open to innovative ways to change what has been, definitely pressure points in Metro Vancouver and BC around the housing crisis for years.
Hmm.
So, but knowing that, I know that
Hmm.
because I'm here and I do housing all
Yeah.
day. And so, but I see, like, their challenge was the rollout and how that was communicated and not being quite ready to say,
Yeah.
this is what we're looking at.
No,
So I think as we
they didn't
see
have the
this
details.
they didn't have the details, and they also
Yeah.
had the disadvantage of, they had also in the February budget made some massive cuts around stopping a fund that was being very heavily relied on by the nonprofit housing and private sector housing providers, which is about a $10 million like hit here into the system. So they came out of this like stopping the intake of a fund that was very much being relied on to get nonprofit and affordable housing out there, and then come
Hmm.
up with this idea. So it's hard to then square it, I think, for the public about what the goals are. Now, I just believe, knowing where Eby's brain works on housing, and he is an innovative guy and he listens to people who have new ideas on particularly on housing, that there is something they have underway here. But it is fascinating to watch the feds sort of go, well, that's BC's idea, right? Like
Mm.
and you're right, where they are giving a lot of leeway here to say, BC negotiated this in, it's going to be theirs to go run with. But the other thing the premier said is he I think, like, they are clear that there is a plan here. But he's also, he said a couple weeks ago that if people really don't like it, they won't proceed on it. So, there's
Yeah.
again some flexibility there on the Fed-provincial deal to change policy.
Mm. I wonder how much as well it weighs into on the BC front. The federal relationship weighs into the idea that somebody who's obviously very hostile to the federal Liberals just got elected as the BC Conservative leader. It's not the old,
Yeah,
unite
yeah,
the right, broad right in
yeah, and
BC.
they went
These are
out really
people who,
hard on it.
yeah,
Yeah,
he's just like, they're kind of being dicks. And so he's like, well, okay, if you guys don't want to play,
yeah,
I'll work with the people who are there.
Yeah,
One
but
other
you're right.
one
It's
that
not a
was
condo
interesting.
bailout like Ford. We're talking about actually the long-term plan really is something the premier's been talking about for a while,
Yeah,
which is making it easier for people to find new ways to buy into the market, at
right.
the same time as they deal with the rental market. So it'll be
Mm,
interesting to see where they go, but I'm sure I know there's things percolating. It just didn't roll out
right.
that way.
Well, we'll have to watch and see whether it is a bailout or it really is a kind of inventive
Yeah, I
solution.
doubt we'll see bailout. But we'll see if we can
Well,
come back on that
they
at some
certainly got the
point.
caution flag now, don't they? So they're going to have to work really hard to make it into something that, yeah.
Yeah.
One other one that was interesting in the last few months, was it the last few months, is the canola deal with China. So
Yeah.
and the deal to allow some Chinese-made vehicles into Canada, which
Mhm.
deeply upset the auto industry, Unifor,
Yeah.
uh, Doug Ford, of course. Mart Styles. Everybody had to be like, because we're so engaged with the auto industry,
Mhm.
and this is just an offshore source. This is not a manufactured in Canada
Mhm.
source, but squaring China and peeling Scott Moe away from Daniel Smith a little bit, getting prairie
Yeah.
farmers settled down, that I guess that was just more attractive. So it seems to have got Mr. Moe in his place, right? He's a pretty quiet guy
Mhm.
these days.
He has been very quiet these days. We were talking about that with Carla Beck, right?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, and but these are, I think, the sort of questions around where the prime minister moves is, what's the long-term implication? What is the short-term solution that he's trying to drive, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, um, I think there's the question I hear from people often is like, are we just not seeing the strategy behind all of this, or is there no strategy? And I think a lot of people, they're
Yeah.
still kind of leaning into there must be there must be a large gameplay at works here. So that will only
Well,
be told by time.
yeah. Well, that's the liberals are always playing fourth dimensional chess, and we're just too dumb to understand it line, right? Um, when in fact you go, oh, actually, they just really had no clue, and they're stumbling around
Yeah,
like
like
anybody
everybody else
else,
is.
right? Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Let's just take a little tour across the country, or at least some major parts of the country. Houston, I would say Houston, Frechette. She's the new premier in Quebec.
Mhm.
Uh, Ford, Moe, Smith, and Eby are all
Mhm.
under some political pressure.
Mhm.
Um, so the question in voters' minds is stay or change.
Mm.
Change always or can imply risk. I was thinking, Nikki, do you think that the leaders who are facing the pressure are doing enough to highlight the risk of their alternatives?
Mm.
Do you think the opposition leaders who are wanting to increase the pressure are doing enough to lower the perceptions of risk out
Yeah.
of change, risk of change? Um, or in a weird way, at some point, it's the incumbent premier who becomes the risk. It's like, we can't go on with this person, right? It's
Mhm.
just too
Yeah.
much. We have to move whatever. Like, it's less risky to get somebody who's unknown, untried, and whatever, because we just can't continue in this direction. What do you think? This is
Yeah.
a big challenge, I think, in your province. What do you think in the BC situation about this idea of risk?
Well, I mean, BC's interesting, not just today,
Yes.
always. So,
Yeah.
and I actually think like things have shifted here a bit. And certainly, it was a tough spring. There were some few concerning polls. I always say that I don't ever have an issue with politicians seeing some concerning polls, 'cause it means they got to start to regroup on what's
Yeah.
causing those. But it was a really tough spring here in the legislature in BC on the UN declaration, overlaid with that conservative leadership race, an even tougher budget. So I would say, like, if we were talking mid-June, the feeling was very different for David Eby. But even at that point, you really the only place you were seeing that call for a change in NDP leader was the BC Conservatives on like social media, right? You weren't hearing
Mm.
it within the NDP. You weren't maybe a little bit in the media saying how long is he going to stay? but it wasn't something happening, I think, like large, widespread, even in with saw some of those polls getting tighter. Our polls are always tight here. But I would say it
Right.
was a tough, going into mid-June, been a really tough spring. But I think coming out through the last couple weeks of mid-June, I think we're in a different scenario here. And a couple things happened, I think, for David Eby that helped. One was, the China trip, helpful first trip
Hmm.
to China. Maybe not on the public radar, but leans into that some of those trade mission needs. But the big thing I think was two things happened in parallel. One was the BC Conservatives did their first leadership shuffle in terms of their management team, House Leader, caucus management, all those roles, and went in with Carrie Lynn Finley putting all of the, furthest right in her party that
Yeah.
had supported her into those roles. So really gives the media and the public an indication of when the premier is talking about that MAGA, back again then to what you're talking about, influence within the BC Conservatives, it's very clear
Mm.
when you look at who they just put into those key influencing roles within the party. So that gives then, I think, as we're talking about any opposition leader and then any current premier who saw, because a lot of them saw their polls come down through the spring, not, pretty understandable with those budgets that everybody brought in and those
Hmm.
deficits and affordability, I
And
think.
unemployment and
Um,
inflation
yeah.
and
Unless
yeah,
you're
a lot
Walk
of different
Canoe,
things.
you're pretty much like having
Yeah.
seen a tough spring. And so I think, but in, getting in that federal provincial BC deal, I'm going to say that the next poll we see has a bump. Premier Eby also got a new caucus member in recent weeks. Someone who was
Hmm.
elected as a BC Conservative had left that caucus to be an independent. Amelia Boltby is now a new Democrat. So,
Hmm.
no longer a one-seat majority in BC. It's a
She was
two-seat with
kind.
an election 2 years
She was
away.
more of a
So
centrist conservative, or what's her history like?
yeah, I think she
That's an
came in like,
unusual move, right?
well, if we remember how the BC Conservatives and the BC United came together pretty quickly right before the
Yeah.
election when BC United folded. So that's, it is an
Hmm.
unusual makeup of a party still. So I think we'll see David Eby have a bump. I think it was a good latter half of June. Now we're going to go back into a really heated fall, I'm sure, around reconciliation, unfortunately. But I think if we think about other provinces and how it works, the unfortunate thing is I think we're into heavy polarization. And it is because either we have some of those more right-leaning conservative governments in place, and then, the Democrats trying to flank and show the alternative here, or the opposite, where, in BC, it is able to draw a direct line to say, here is, what New Democrats are presenting. You may not be happy with overall performance. We're, continuing to try to shift these big policy pieces like housing, like healthcare, like jobs, and focus on major
Mm.
projects. And our alternative is a very clearly, you know,
High risk.
yeah. And that's
Yeah.
that's the narrative we're
Right.
hearing. So I would
Taken
imagine we hear that in
taken
other
away.
provinces too.
Right, taking away labor rights, including
Yeah.
training rights from the trades. Probably an assault on rent control.
Yeah.
Giving up on the idea that there should be any social housing construction whatsoever. Who knows what their attitude is towards slashing budgets to try and
Yeah.
bring balance to,
Yeah.
so I just think they could work hard on just like making them the issue while they're trying to
Yeah.
de-risk themselves by, well, we saw it in the StatsCan numbers on Friday. um BC's unemployment rate, I think, came down 0.3.
Mm-hmm.
Ontario so it's like at 6.4 or something, 6.4.
Mm-hmm.
Ontario was 7. Alberta 7. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
they could de-risk themselves a little bit and look like, well, they're not perfection on earth, but they're doing
Yeah.
reasonably well. And those other guys, I think that's going to be worse for me.
Yeah.
In a way that's kind of like next door in Alberta, you can very actively see Nenshi putting in that idea that
Yeah.
Daniel Smith is the risk.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And maybe why Scott
Uh,
Moe's heads down a little bit more these days, right? So he's not
yes.
putting it up as the risk when he's starting to be 2 years from an election. So, Tim
Well,
Houston's not necessarily keeping his head down in the same way, but I think,
yeah.
I don't think you actually, Carolyn Finley is interesting because she's so values based and her platform is very, like, it's freedom and faith. But interestingly, I actually saw some polling the other day that showed that Canadians are talking about freedom as a value in pretty big ways right now. And it's, hard
Hmm.
to say what that means to them. But
Hmm.
there is a shift in voter perception about where we're at in the world and in their lives and what they need. And interestingly, that, concept of freedom is leaning in pretty heavily in Western Canada.
Interesting. Yeah. Um, in like when we talked to Carla Beck a couple of weeks ago, I thought, well, she's got a natural advantage in the fact that she's already got a large caucus, so she doesn't have that
Hmm.
much many more seats that she has to pick up to get rid of Scott Moe.
Yeah.
So that's great. But she also said a couple of things that I thought were very smart. She said, you know, after 17 years or whatever it's been of Scott Moe government, Scott Moe talking about how bad the NDP in Saskatchewan was, et cetera, people believe it.
Yeah.
So we have to change their minds. We have
Yeah.
to go to places that we haven't gone to for a long time. Now they have the caucus size that they can do that.
Yeah.
And show them the plans that make them feel comfortable,
Yeah.
right? De-risking the
Totally.
Sask NDP. So
Yeah.
Mo is the risk because he's just an incompetent boob, and Carla is the competent one who's talking to people about developing electricity plans, developing healthcare plans. Anybody can look at them. I think that's a
Hmm.
pretty smart way of going
Engaging people on
at.
them. Yeah.
Yes, right.
Yeah.
Pretty smart way of going about it. On her train. Um, Nenshi, I'm not sure. Like, he can definitely make the argument that Smith and the separatists are the risk and the kind of chaos that
Hmm.
they create. But he's got his own kind of risk problems that
Yeah.
he can get thrown at him um, around. I think probably the oil patch, and that secretly he's of
Yeah.
course a tree hugger or something like that. Um, but which is bad news in Alberta, I guess. But
Yeah.
that risk idea, um, and just to take it one further in Ontario, I think we're seeing something where the risk on Doug Ford is growing. Like people just see it as a less and less competent
Hmm.
government that does things for strange reasons, but still rather popular, even though Ford himself is really disliked, or at least people say they will continue to
Hmm.
vote for him. And I think this goes to the idea of what are my alternatives?
Yeah. Yeah.
And Mart Stiles is in a different situation because if you say, I don't like this government, I want to vote for somebody else,
Right.
now there's a competition between who that somebody else is going to be. Is it going
Yeah.
to be the Liberals or is it going to be Mart Stiles and the NDP?
Yeah.
So Carly doesn't have that. Nenshi doesn't have that. But I think as
Yeah. Right
well,
now, David Eby
she,
doesn't have that, but we'll see how
yeah,
everything
yeah,
goes here.
maybe there'll be a
We
new
never
Liberal
know.
Party. But that's an interesting, it's a dynamic that is not only in Ontario, but
Hmm.
it's not common provincially.
Yeah.
And the thing Mart's ability to project herself as the option to get the province back on track, right?
Hmm.
The lower risk. So if you think about it that way, what would be the strategy to try and establish yourself as that competent alternative choice
Hmm.
to do the things that Doug, you know, rebuild the jobs, rebuild the industries, to, work on paychecks, work on housing,
Yeah.
work on like the fundamentals. Um, and the Liberals can try, but the Liberals, I don't know. I I
Yeah.
don't I don't know whether they can do it. But anyway, it just seems like that's the project for Mart is to
Yeah.
differentiate herself on the affirmative, not just on the negative against Doug.
Well, I mean, I actually think the project for all these leaders, whether they're in government or opposition right now, and progressives, is that I think, where we're seeing that shift, and maybe it goes back to that kind of concept of things like freedom showing up in,
Right.
polling is things that people are thinking about. Is the and there could be lots of layers to that in terms of what we've gone through since the U.S. administration changed. But I also think like we are in a it is a we are seeing a shifting mood in the public. We've seen that, I think. We're seeing a big shift on things like approaches to Indigenous rights. We're seeing a big shift in the public on their feelings about immigration, whether people are immigrants or not. We are seeing more anti-immigration feelings within public domain polling showing up. And so I think where leaders and parties are going to struggle, and I think this is a struggle for someone like Vinci, because while, there's low support for in Alberta for separatism and for actually, moving away from Canada, there is actually still high support, even among progressive voters and union voters and others, for some of the underlying who's to blame
Mm,
for what we perceive as our grievances in Alberta about how we're not
yeah.
being treated fairly or how we're not getting our share. And a lot of that does go back into where that grievance-based feeling and who in the last 6 years is to blame for why I don't feel like I'm better off. And it's not governments. It's going to be immigrants. It's going to be First Nations. It's going to be those groups that aren't to blame, but that it's easy to draw those lines too
Yeah.
for folks who are really focused on that. Why am I not feeling, why am I feeling like my life is worse right now? So that's going to be the
Hmm.
real tricky part for progressive politicians, is how not to lean in to somewhere where we're seeing some of this growing sentiment, how to counter it, and then how to know that the right opposition to them, no matter what form they're in, is going to be really trying to keep wedging it.
Hmm. Yeah, I think it's, difficult for Nenshi, for he to try to, well, I think, as you say, there's this anti-Indigenous, mm, narrative that got amplified because of the pipeline debate.
Hmm.
And, that's just the way it was going to go. Um, and then she supported them, the First Nations in Alberta on that fight, which I think is right. But he's gotta, as well as fight it on that basis or support them in their fight, also find somehow an economic agenda that is positive.
Hmm. Yeah.
Because if he cannot, if like we were talking about, I was suggesting this the other week, like I don't believe the story. I don't believe that the numbers back the story that the Alberta oil industry is paying the wages that it used to, and that everybody's,
Right. Yeah.
like that's just not playing out
Yep.
the way it is. But I think a lot of people still in their minds have this
Yeah.
idea that everything is very dependent upon the oil industry, and that's like that's jobs in Alberta.
Hmm.
It's like, no, it's part of it,
Hmm.
but it's not like it's just a part of it.
Yeah.
Um, so I guess the question, the challenge for Nenshi is like, how do you try and say, okay, without getting into real dust up with the oil and gas industry, who will
Hmm.
like fucking chop his head off, right? Because those are
Yeah.
brutal
And still an
people,
important economic driver in that
right?
province. Yeah.
Right. So without getting into that, how to try and outline an economic agenda people will feel comfortable with, and saying, okay, Nenshi has a plan to, we
Hmm.
accept. And in fact, you kind of can implicitly say, like, we accept that the oil and gas industry is declining in this province. We see it in the numbers. It's just a fact. UPC is
Hmm.
lying about that. But we're not going to get into a fight about that. What we're going to get a fight about is who's got a plan to
Yeah.
diversify the economy, get other sectors working strongly as well, and create jobs, because it got
Yeah.
high unemployment. And, I think Mart, in a way, in Ontario has a similar challenge. Now,
Hmm.
to try and come up with that alternative plan, it's tough.
Yeah.
Um, Claudia Gender,
Yeah. It's
we had her on.
exciting. It's good.
Yeah, she's had some
Highlight, like
great
to close with
polls.
a highlight.
Yeah. What do you think the story is there?
Well, I actually
Why the
think
sudden
it's an
change?
example there, because we are seeing some of that polling shift and seeing it more and more. And we had James Falcon a few weeks ago, but also we're seeing it in other polls around Nova Scotia and province. I actually think it's the being able to deliver that alternative vision that they're doing so well, and that Claudia Schindler does
Mm,
herself, but also that commitment to getting out and talking to people, right? And I
mm,
think I've been thinking about organizing in different ways. And I think what the Nova Scotia NDP is trying to do is, because there's only so you can't stay online and have good conversations. You can't have any good conversations online, really. Let's just accept that at this point. But they're getting out there and actually talking to people in community. So I think there's something there that's
yeah.
driving the alternative voice, and they're doing it well. And obviously, smaller communities to get out and have the conversations. But you put Claudia out there to talk to people. And when we talked to her, she was planning on, I think she noted, after seeing her kids, spending a lot of
Yeah.
time out in community on the
Yep.
road this summer. So I think that's where we see these bumps. And if politicians, we can't really counter disinformation and the way the public is feeling about their lives right now without some of those direct conversations. I think they're showing that in Nova Scotia.
Mm. Yeah. I thought it was one of the things that stuck out from the interview we did with her was her comment that Tim Houston makes people feel like they're just some number on the side of a spreadsheet.
Yeah.
And he kind of comes off that way, cool,
Yeah.
cold even.
Yeah.
And she is very personable, right?
Yeah.
Like to me, yeah, like she just seems straightforward, uh, kind of like down home person,
Yeah.
who understands
It's
Nova
got your
Scotian
back,
and
right?
straightforward.
Yeah.
So I think that's a lot of her strength,
Mhm.
and the Liberals now being in third, obviously, in somewhat disarray. But I think her
Mhm.
challenge is like, and again, not to over compare with Ontario, but that's where I am, and I think about it a lot.
Yeah.
She's got the same challenge as Mart Stiles does, which is there's a lot of room still that she has to make up
Yes. Yeah.
because the PCs did very well in the last election, and so to
Yeah.
get, I can't remember her seat count, but it's a lot of distance.
Yeah.
It's not like
Oh,
Carla
yeah.
Beck. It's not like Carla Beck
Yeah.
where you just got to pick up 4 or 5 seats. So really, that challenge of thinking about that audience outside of Cape Breton, outside of Halifax,
Yeah.
where can you get wins, and how do you connect with the small towns
Yeah.
of Halifax and make people feel like this is somebody who's gonna like doesn't treat me
Mhm.
like a number on a spreadsheet, right? Who's
Yeah.
in touch with the issues. Talked a lot about electricity, right? She's been good on
Yeah.
that one. Those are good ones. The culture piece I think that she talked about was
Yeah. Yeah.
interesting. Like this is a people come to Nova Scotia as tourists because they love our culture. The little like she talked about the Marmalade Festival or the Jam Festival in
Yeah.
whatever small town that they do on some weekend in the summer,
Yeah.
and people head out of Halifax and go see that, and they spend local tourist dollars, and like that's a plus, right? You got to
Yeah.
protect that, not only as a culture but as a business, as an industry.
Mhm.
So she seemed in touch with that too. So that might
Mhm.
help her find those places. Now I think she's got a bit of
Yeah.
time, right?
Yeah, so that's some time. I also think, when I think about where Claudia's at right now and the Claudia versus Tim Houston, is it does remind me of our, working for the BC NDP in the rebuilding years after the catastrophic loss in '01. When Carol James came in 2003 and Gordon Campbell was becoming, increasingly unpopular because of a similar Tim Houston approach, cuts, being distant from people, like being, that downtown Vancouver
Hmm.
guy, that had to throw on a
Yeah.
plaid shirt to make himself look like he was one of the people. And Carol reminds me, I think, of that, this strong woman with strong social values who we put out on the road to talk to people like a human. And like, we didn't win that 2005 election, that first one, or the '09 election. But it's remarkable how quickly we rebuilt after being decimated with a Carol James being the opponent to a Gordon Campbell. And I think there's actually a Tim Houston, Claudia Gender parallel here in
Hmm.
what it means to have that, that woman, that person who is leader, who is a counter to that more seen as cold,
Hmm.
separate from the
Yeah.
public kind of
Yeah.
premier like a Houston that we should keep watching.
Yeah. Oh, we should say something about Quebec because there's going to be election this fall.
Yeah,
And remember,
go
we
for it.
had yeah, well, we exactly. Well, we've had a couple of discussions with the Quebec politics, a
Mhm,
couple of updates, and I think the last one that we did was um, Frechette had just taken over as
mhm,
CAQ leader and premier of the province. The CAQ had been 1 point down as low as like 9% in the worst poll or something like that, like 9% for the CAQ governing party. The PQ was way ahead, but like 35, 37, I think, kind of zones. Very minority government feeling, but maybe on a
mhm,
split could become a majority. Liberals get a new leader. Frechette comes along. And now if we look at the polls, it's like the Liberals are in the low 20s, I believe. Frechette is brought the CAQ back into
mhm,
the 20s, and the PQ has come down. And
mhm.
because of vote distribution in the province, it's the West Island is you know, there's ridings that just go 80% for no, I don't know, I'm making that up, but massively go liberal, the Anglophone vote. But so it's really concentrated in the other seats where things will be won or lost. So I would interpret this as meaning that Frechette is bringing back some votes from the PQ, and
Mm,
that the idea which Paladam is big on, which is we're going to have a referendum on separation. And like he's like, that's what we're going to do when you elect a
yeah.
PQ government. But people are like, why?
Yeah.
Only about
Why now? Yeah.
a third of people are interested in that. It's
Yeah.
not going to go, and we're just going to get everybody else like risk like
Hmm.
again. So, all right, like she seems very engaging. She seems very energetic, and she scored some money off the feds, right? So
Yeah. Yeah.
she's a change from Legault.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I don't know, that risk idea may play again. That PQ looks like the risky
Yeah.
option, whereas the CAQ looks like maybe more okay, new leader,
Yeah.
but let's just stay where we are.
And a new
Uh,
leader
uh,
can ride that a long time, right? So
yeah, and
we
I worry about
often see.
we'll see how that works out for the Quebec Solidaire. I don't, not they're
Hmm.
not polling so great, but
Yeah. Okay,
we'll
well,
see.
we covered a bunch of big
That's a lot.
topics and weighty
Yes.
questions. There's lots here about where Canadian politics is heading, and I think some parallel lessons for some of the provinces going into elections, or many just 2 years from an election. Sitting here in BC as well, but we just talked about a lot of others that are in the same zone. We're going to have a busy
Hmm.
2028 if everything stays on target for all these elections.
Hmm.
So that's our
Alberta.
so trying to wrap
Yep.
up the first 6 months of the year. We'll see how we do in December when we wrap up a year. But let's
Yeah.
take a quick break and come back with Love It or Heave It.
Okay. Before we wrap up, we've come to that part of the show we like to call Love It or Heave It, about something you love and want to keep, or something you'd like to heave and forever forget. What about you, Nikki? Loving or heaving this week?
I'm going to geek out and love me some land use planning, like a total conservation nerd. And you probably won't hear a lot of people say that. But we've been talking a lot about pipelines, tanker bans, major
Mm,
projects. It's dominating the news cycle. What I'm actually loving are next steps around conservation planning in the context of a lot of these major projects as well. So BC's actually been rolling out some next steps that are long coming in places that have, been much beloved in the province and much advocated for. There's conservation takes a heck of a lot time to do, decades in consultation and working with First Nations. But a number of new projects to go into the next stages in the last couple of weeks, including the Jumbo Watershed in Southeast BC, which folks may know of, the Skagit River headwaters near the Canada-U.S. border, and then old growth Roush Valley up near Prince George. So there's also been some movement. You'll hear, if you're listening to Prime Minister Carney talk about the Northwest Critical Conservation Corridor in the context of major projects. And I think that conservation word's really important in there because there's mining, critical minerals, lots of work happening, but also, again, land use planning going on with First Nations. So I think these are exciting pieces to see because it is that balance. I think it's the seeking that balance of conservation, reconciliation, and economic growth at the same time is important to keep driving governments on. But why am I loving land use planning? It's one of those things where I think no one really should be paying attention to land use planning overall, but it is a very complex long-term process, which is why I love it, because it's actually bringing together all of these different stakeholders. So there's a lot of work with First Nations, but then a huge part of the process is making sure local communities, the public, industry, other advocates have some input, ability to have some transparency, ensuring that there's accountability with government, and making sure that all those perspectives are being put forward for community when talking about how to protect the land base. So I am a fan of land use of planning. I'm a fan of marine planning because it actually does bring these perspectives in. And the idea is when you get to the final result of the conservation plan, you don't have these conflicts. You've actually dealt with them in the process, as we should, by being able to sit down and have those dialogues. So keep
Mm.
bringing on these plans. They're going to take forever to finish up, and we see different types of engagement rolling out right now, but I can tell you these are decades in the making, and great to see get to these next steps with some actual collaborative planning processes going on.
Some things should be outside politics,
Exactly.
right?
Many things should
Some
be
things should
outside
be.
politics and
We've
government.
talked about this a bit. It's kind of an interesting theme of what should be outside politics.
Yeah. Yeah. What about you, Tom? What's
Long,
on your mind?
well, I am heaving pollsters.
Mm,
That's kind of
it's a lot of
anyway.
people to
Despite that,
heave.
yeah, I know. Actually, I'm very specific. I am heaving
Okay.
pollsters who use decimal points, and pollsters who are giving us a lot of spin that they know is spin. Um, if a pollster measures, say, the federal Liberals at 41% one month and the next month it's 42, it is absolutely absurd for them to put out a press release saying the Liberals have gained 1 point and ramble on
Mm,
about, like, here's my analysis of why. Like, that's just fun fact. Given polls margins of error, we can draw no conclusions about a change of 1 point for anything. So for all we know, in the example I just gave, maybe the actual support went down a point or two. We really don't know. It was all
yeah.
within the margin of error. And certainly, some sort of explanation about why party X or party Y went up or down a point, like, save it. You're making yourself look, frankly, dumb. Um, and and if we
Heaving
can't be
and
sure about,
insulting some pollsters, Tom.
I know. Okay. And if we can't, well, I feel like it's actually insulting to me as a poll user when people, try and tell me that, going up 1 point is because, Doug Ford did this or it's like, no, we don't even know that he did go up 1 point. So give it a rate. Um, and if we can't be sure that a rating of 42 is actually higher than a rating of 41, then, like, Nick Nanos is the one on this one that drives me nuts. He
Mm.
reports things like, oh, they're at 41.1%. Like, that is just nonsense. Um, it is nonsense for pollsters to put out a press release with decimals or to make claims about a single point move. That is entirely spin. And part two, Nikki, while I'm talking about this, it is nonsense for reporters to uncritically reproduce decimal data or unsupportable claims
Mm,
about polling data. Just to kind of write down what a pollster puts in their press release about how a party went up or a party went down by 1 point because we don't even know that they did go up or down. So leave the because out. And because you're supposed to be a real journalist, um, and an expert, you should not be reporting that. Um, but some days it just feels like reporters just will write down whatever BS in a box if it has a bow on it. Like, they'll just write her up. So okay, I'm not in the camp that believes that polling is fake news. I don't believe that whatsoever. But if I did a survey, Nikki, that said there were between 40 and 45 people in the room, and then reported that it's actually exactly 42 or 42.1 in the room, um, that would be for fake news. Like, that
mm.
would be fake. And it would be fake if some reporter just wrote it down that, Tom Parkin did a survey and found that there were 42 people in the room. No, I didn't say that. The data actually says between 40 and 45. Okay. So, like, we should all just pull it back on the pollsters, ask them to give us the numbers, look at long-term trends. That's what's useful. And what bothers me is the pollsters and political reporters who know that that's what they should be doing, but give us this nonsense anyway. So there we go.
There you
Side note,
go.
we do know this. We all know this. So really what they're burning is their own credibility over time. And
Uh,
honestly, I don't want to see that. I don't want to see media or pollsters start to be eaten up with the cynicism that they create.
well, we'll see which pollsters we're in the listening list
Yeah.
for that
Yeah.
pick up on. You've got your nerd love for land use planning for me, and the rant from Tom for the week as we wrap up. Um,
Yes, well, 42%, 42.1% of me is happy with this episode so far. So
See, we're not turfing that decimal point yet.
that's, wow.
Before we close, and knowing who is listening to our show, I think an important acknowledgement as well. We wanted to acknowledge someone whose passing has had a tremendous impact on the labor movement across the country, and especially in BC this week, who is former BCGU President Stephanie Smith. We know from who our listeners are and what they tell us they're listening to that you're all feeling this very closely in your hearts this week. And for those that didn't know Steph, she was an early child care educator, an activist from the ground who became the first woman elected as the president of the BCGU, which is has a large number of women. So at this point, she's the only woman who was elected to be president of the GU, and it's a 100-year history. So a trailblazer for women across the country in the labor movement who have come after her. And she was also a friend, a deeply compassionate, a funny human, a wise human who touched many people. And so her loss this week is being heavily felt. And I know with our demographics, that she will be honored forever, and we're really grateful to have the opportunity to speak to her. So that's how we're going to wrap up this week with a toast to Steph Smith. But you can email us at lefteasttowest@gmail.com. Let us know what you are loving or heaving or looking at this week, and then tap that follow button on your favorite podcast channel to get reminders for upcoming interviews, because we're still going to keep going throughout the summer. Thanks for joining us in our 6-month review and some rants and some tributes and some nerding out. Have a great week, Tom.
All right, will do. You too.
Thanks for joining Left East to West with hosts Nikki Hill and Tom Parkin. We'd love to hear your comments, ratings, follows, and shares. It helps people find us. To become a Left East to West community member and to help us reach even more Canadians, subscribe using the link in the show notes. You can watch us on YouTube or listen wherever you get your favorite podcasts. Just search for Left East to West and subscribe. I'm Doug Hamilton signing off for Left East to West. We'll see you next week.